Chapter 2: A Compromised Constitution. Wrath-kindled gentlemen, be ruled by me. Deep malice makes too deep incision. Shakespeare, King Richard II, 1.1, 152 to 155. The Shah was born in Tehran, a city that lives in the shadow of mountains and myth. More than any other city in Iran, it's real and mythopoetic. Mythopoeic. Never heard of that word before. More than any other city in Iran, it's real and mythopoeic. History captured the tormented soul of Iran. To the north stands the towering, sometimes snow-capped, often eulogized Mount Damavand, haloed by clouds that emanate from the coast of the Caspian Sea. According to Shahnameh, the grand epic poem of pre-Islamic Persian history, Zahak, the dreaded demon of Iranian mythology, lurks in some dark recess of the 18,600-foot mountain. The story goes that Jamshid, a reformist king who rendered iron pliable, made from the mountain helmets, breastplates, and others arms, and laid up stores of weapons. He built houses and baths, castles and palaces, and his service to the people was commemorated on the day they called Nowruz, which is still, many millennia later, celebrated as the Persian New Year. But Jamshid, legend has it, fell prey to hubris. He told the elders and army commanders and priests that there is no leader or king in all the world greater than him. The gods punished him by taking away his charisma, Farah-e-Izzadi, and before long, the people rose up against him. After a long period of chaos and confusion, people sought Zahak the Arab to come and rule over them. His 1,000-year reign then became, in the collective memory of Iranian history, the epitome of oppression and cruelty. From the south come the desert winds howling from the flatlands that cover the geographic heart of the country. Less than 100 miles south of Tehran, in the midst of that desolate landscape, there is Shemkaran, a mosque built atop a well that has long been dry of water, but is effervescent of messianic hope. Shiites, the majority in Iran, believe that their 12th Imam, the Mahdi, went into hiding some 1,000 years ago, and some of these millenarian Shiites believe that once he decides to reappear, as he certainly will, he will ascend from the pit of that well. Caught between the mythic mountain and the magic well, constrained by the inexorable force of its geography and history, sits the city of Turan, where on October 26, 1919, in a small and modest house in one of the city's older residential districts, a boy was born. They called him Mohammad Reza. His mother, Taj-ul-Muluk, was a self-assertive woman of strong views. His father, Reza Khan, was a charismatic officer of the Cossack Brigade, initially established by the Russian Tsar, and by the time of Mohammad Reza's birth already under the command of Iranian officers. In fact, Reza Khan was one of the first Iranians to take such a command. The house was a typical example of traditional urban Persian architecture, an insular, inward-looking building with high walls to keep away the intrusive gaze of strangers. Like the Persian language, in which the surface and substantive meanings of words, the zahr and batan, are often in discordant contrast in traditional Persian architecture. Houses are sharply divided between the andaran and the biran, the private and public domains. The facades of these houses are humble and bereft of ostentation. In contrast to the feigned simplicity of the facades, the interiors are usually rich with lavish appointments. Mohammad Reza's house of birth was no exception. Protected by high brick walls on two sides of the yard, stood interconnected rooms, 5 steep stones steep above the ground. Underneath the building were rooms often used for storage in winter and as cool haven in the sometimes sizzling days of summer. In the middle of the yard stood a small round palm. Footnote: Epitome of oppression and cruelty. Footnote: In recent years, some cultural critics have tried to deduce from Iranian mythology the predestined path of the country's history. The long night of despotism, they argue, has been the result of the murder of Sohrab by his father Rostrum, the hero of Shahnameh. Filicide, they say, is a precursor for status and patriarch despotism. If Iran is ever to transcend its cursed cycle of replacing one despot with another, or one father with another, in the words of Feridun Hoveyda, it must jettison its attachment to Rostrum and embrace instead the story of Kekavos, a benevolent and democratic king who shared power with others and descended from the throne when he could no longer be of service to his people. See Feridun Hoveyda, The Shah and the Ayatollah, Iranian Mythology and Islamic Revolution. New York, 2003. Pages 102 to 105. End of footnote. As Reza Khan's fortunes grew, the family moved into bigger houses and better neighborhoods. Of those early years and the houses they lived in, Mohammad Reza remembers only the beauty of the mountains that loomed over the city. Not far from where he was born, there were a dry moat and a mud wall that encircled the capital. The wall, with its 12 mostly ornate gates conjuring the 12 imams of Shizm, and its 114 crenellations celebrating the 114 chapters of the Quran, was a relic of Nasir al-Din Shah's late 19th century journey of discovery to Europe. Beginning back at that sentence, the wall with its 12, footnote, some sources have the city with 13 gates, but as 13 is a number of ill omens, most historians talk of 12 gates. Jafar Shari, in his Tehran Gadim, Old Tehran, talks of 13 doors. Tehran 1355, 1977. End of footnote. At night the city gates were closed, while during the day the moat, ever dry and a bleak reminder of Tehran's aridity and its distance from water, became a hangout for dope fiends, pederasts, the musicians disparagingly called motrebs, and stray dogs. The tormented ghost that often prowled Iran's urban landscape. Tehran was in 1919 a city of dirt roads and mud houses, of small streams that acted as open sewage, and at night it was a dark, dread domain dominated by hooligans and bandits, as well as daruga, or the police, whose cruelty and corruption made them even more dangerous and more predatory than the thieves they supposedly kept at bay. Mohammad Reza was barely 6 years old when his father became the king and ordered the encircling mud wall raised and the moat filled. In his ambitious effort to modernize the capital, Reza Shah redrew the map of the city, willing into existence two three-lined boulevards that cut through the labyrinth maze of the old capital. Enforcing his linear, rational grid on the old village that now masqueraded as a city and the capital of the country, Reza Shah also ordered the destruction of all but one of the 12 gates. In this razing frenzy, he was participating in an age-old pattern of Iranian history in which memories of the past and relics of the ancient regime are deemed counter-revolutionary and subversive. 5 hours after Mohammad Reza was born, in the early afternoon, his twin sister, Ashraf, joined him in the world. Compared with the jubilant celebration that had followed his birth, Ashraf's belated arrival, in her own wounded words, begot none of the excitement that greeted my brother's birth. To say that I was unwanted might be harsh, but not altogether far from the truth. An iconic picture taken when she and her twin brother were about 3 years old captures both Mohammad Reza's privileged position and his twin sister's sense of alienation and anguish. The father, mustached, stern, impatient, with piercing eyes, sits on a bench in the backyard of their house, surrounded by pots of flourishing flowers. He is clothed in the dashing white tunic worn by commanders of the Cossack Brigade, tight black trousers tucked neatly into shiny knee-high black boots, the quintessential Cossack fur cap on his head. On his lap sits Mohammad Reza. The father's oversized hands are wrapped around his son's diminutive body. The boy looks at once blissful and anxious. He is biting his lips, lip-biting and twirling a strand of his hair around one of his fingers, were all his life signs of his anger and anxiety. But in spite of the nervous bite, the boy also has the contented look of a mariner who has at long last safely arrived in harbor. Standing between Reza Khan's legs, possessively clutching her father's hand, is Shams Reza Khan's older and favorite daughter. Even as a girl, she wears the petulant and spoiled expression that would define her life. A few steps away, Ashraf stands alone, looking almost disheveled, gazing at the camera in dismay, while the two daughters are attired in similar drab cotton dresses and long dark stockings. The young future Shah wears what looks to be an expensive sailor suit. In his short pants and knee-high socks, the boyish Mohammad Reza looks like a European schoolboy. Reza Khan, the father, was a soldier by temperament, fearless in war, towering in physique, and commanding in comportment. He was relentless in pursuit of his goals and willing to use any means necessary, including bullying and brute force, to achieve his ends. Not long after Mohammad Reza's birth, Reza Khan became the power behind the Iranian throne, and soon enough its occupant, the Shah, had an intense and paradoxical relationship with both the person and the legacy of his father. In his first book, the 336-page Mission for My Country, there are no fewer than 784 distinct references to his father, or in other words, an average of more than 2 per page. In comparison, he mentions his mother only 12 times. He writes of his father as a man of strength, determination, a towering figure, a dominant personality. No man ever believed more in his country, selfless, one of the greatest mind readers. At the same time, in the part of the narrative ostensibly set aside for celebrating his father, he insists that his father influenced him both positively and negatively. He calls one chapter My Unconventional Childhood and refers to Reza Shah as one of the pleasantest men in the world, but also one of the most frightening. This ambivalence was evident not just in the Shah's writings, but in his life as well. He was highly sensitive to much praise of his father. It was something of a rule amongst seasoned courtiers that Reza Shah must not be praised too profusely in front of his son. Mohammad Reza Shah often complained that he had accomplished infinitely more than his father, but that people failed to adequately appreciate his efforts and continued to harp on his father's feats. In 1961, long before the accomplishing any serious reforms of his own, he wrote that although his father carried out so many ambitious and progressive projects, he never promulgated any comprehensive development program such as our present second 7 years plan. In a later book written in the mid-70s, the Shah offers a summary of 50 years in Pahlavi rule in Iran and is even more openly critical of his father, concluding that in the first 20 years, or in other words, during the reign of his father, the country's efforts were focused on neutralizing the negative effects of the past. There was, in practice, little time left for constructive work. Our country's real effort towards progress and prosperity began only after August 19th, 1953. More incredibly still, in the 15-page introduction to the book, the Shah never mentions, even once, his father's name. Even when referring to his own ascent to the throne, he praises a will superior to all human wills for putting the fate of the nation in his hands, making no reference to his father's role in establishing the dynasty. While his failure to praise his father is subtle in these public pronouncements, in private he sometimes went further. In 1972, for example, just at the time when he had squared off against big oil companies, his confidant Elam asked about Reza Shah's valor. Of course I had never seen him in war, the Shah responded, but when he was sick, he didn't have much valor. It is not clear where his father was on that chilly October day around noon when Mohammad Reza was born. Some have him fighting in jungles in the province of Gulen. His daughter, Ashraf, offers a different version, claiming that the father was at home pacing the yard. Pacing was a constant habit of both Reza Shah and his son, Mohammad Reza Shah, anxiously awaiting word from the midwife. In those days, Iran had 9 hospitals, 41 clinics, and 4 trained nurses. There was not a single gynecologist in the country. It was, therefore, not the customary but necessary for women to deliver their children at home. Lucky and prosperous were those like Mohammad Reza's mother, the willful Taj ul Malak, who could afford to have a midwife present. The high infant mortality rate in Iran at the time was one consequence of these medical deficiencies. The paucity of modern public health amenities made life precarious for the infant Mohammad Reza. It soon became apparent that he was a sickly infant. particularly vulnerable to the numerous diseases that wreaked havoc on the country. A country that had, according to one astute medical historian, a compromised constitution at the time. The year Mohammad Reza was born, 1919, saw the height of a worldwide influenza epidemic that had its origins in the heartland of America, but came to be known as the Spanish flu. In sheer number of people killed, estimated to be nearly 100 million worldwide, it is considered the most deadly plague of all time. While the number of people killed in Iran is a matter of considerable controversy, the country was devastated by the disease. Experts suggest that famine, malaria, anemia, and finally opium were responsible for Iran's unusually high mortality rate. The problem of addiction was itself something of a plague. It is estimated that around the time of Mohammad Reza's birth in Tehran, of the city's 250,000 inhabitants, no fewer than 25,000 people, or 10%, were addicted to opium. In cities outside the capital, the problem was at times even more serious. Kerman, for example, was notorious with 25,000 addicts out of a population of 60,000. The advent of World War I only exacerbated conditions in Iran. Russian, Turkish, German, and British forces occupied parts of the country. Tribal disorder made an already enfeebled central government weaker and more vulnerable. Famine took many lives. Predatory and parasitic gangs roamed the countryside and made travel hazardous. Even many of the important urban centers like Yazd and Kashan were in the parasitic grip of hoodlums and gangs. In Kashan, Sayyid Hassan Kashi had established his own veritable dukedom, milking the rich and menacing the poor. It was in the midst of these tumults that Reza Khan contacted the German embassy in Tehran to solicit their help. The idea of using Germany as a third force to countervail against Russia and Britain, the two poles of colonial power in Iran, was beginning to take serious root in Iran at the time. Before long, a group of Iranian nationalists who had settled in Berlin also solicited German assistance in the fight against British and Russian colonialism. In the case of Reza Khan, however, Germany showed no willingness to offer help. But the story of his relationship with Germany, particularly after the rise of Nazism, proved singularly important not only to his life, but in the fate of his son, Mohammad Reza. Next to the war, the Bolshevik Revolution, leading to the removal of Tsarist forces from Iran, had the most profound impact on the country's political dynamics. In 1918, with Russia temporarily out of the picture, Britain, in a policy championed by Lord Curzon, opted to make Iran a virtual protectorate. By bribing the monarch, Ahmad Shah, the last king of the Qajar dynasty, his prime minister, and two other members of the cabinet, the British government tried to pass what came to be known as the 1919 Agreement. It would place British advisors at the helm of the most important ministries as well as of the army. A strong nationalist movement developed in opposition to the agreement. On the international scene, the United States, and now Soviet government, and France were also actively campaigning against the agreement. Amongst the few Persian advocates of the agreement was a journalist called Sayyid Zia. His support marked him irrevocably with the infamy of being a British stooge. And thus, 1919, the year Mohammad Reza was born, marked a turning point in Sayyid's long and eventful life. 1919 was also the year of the Treaty of Versailles. Iran tried desperately to take part in the negotiations and to make its case about the damages the country had suffered as a result of the war. Britain was adamantly opposed to Iran's participation, while the United States intervened on Iran's behalf. Syed Zia openly ridiculed Iran's effort to participate in the conference. The British Foreign Office describes Syed as a man of outstanding singleness of purpose and courage, personally attractive, religious without being fanatical or obscurantist. He is both honest and energetic, a very rare combination in Persia, has something of a mystic in him. Iranian sources have called Syed Zia the most notorious Anglophile politician in modern Iranian history. Syed never denied having close ties with the British. I was a friend of the British, he declared, because being their friend you only pay a price, but being their enemy guarantees your destruction. All my life I have paid the price for this friendship, but as a rational man, I was never ready to be destroyed. Syed would soon play a huge role in the establishment of Reza Khan's dynasty and his installation on the throne. By 1921, when the young Mohammad Reza was only 2 years old, Iran was on the verge of disintegration. In each corner of the country, a warlord or a revolutionary leader had staked a claim to parts of the territory. In the northern provinces, an alliance between Iranian communist Soviet forces that had landed on the Iranian side of the Caspian coast and a nationalist figure called Mirza Kuchik Khan led to the creation of the first Soviet Socialist Republic in Iran. In Khorasan, there were increasing signs of Bolshevik influence. There were even indications that the province's governor, Ahmed Kavam, often simply called Kavam al-Sultaneh, was contemplating a declaration of independence. Kavam went on to become a lifelong nemesis of the young Mohammad Reza Shah. Another nationalist colonel named Pesian led a rebellion against the central government. Finally, Sheikh Khazal, an unabashed agent of the British government, declared the oil-rich province of Khuzestan a veritable British protectorate. The Sheikh acted as a virtual head of state and went so far as to publish a book titled Agreements and Treaties between the British government and His Honor, Sheikh-e-Mahamara. So crucial was Khuzestan to British geostrategic plans that when it became clear that the 1919 agreement was headed for defeat, Britain began contemplating plans to help the region break away from Iran. In all of their plans in Iran, the British could invariably count on the complicity of some mendacious Iranians, in this case, Mohammad Ali Mirza, Iran's crown prince at the time, contacted the British government and suggested that he was prepared to head new government in southern Persia, separate from northern Persia. If installed as the king, he would, he promised, protect British oil interests. The British had become concerned with the rise of Bolshevism in Iran and closely monitored the activities of every known communist and worked with Reza Khan, who took particular pride in his record as an anti-communist. In 1925, for example, according to the report of the British Embassy in Tehran, there were about 300 suspects under close surveillance. As Bolshevik agents, mostly Russian, The embassy kept a close watch on their vulnerability and movement. Hitherto, the British, still hoping for the ratification of the 1919 agreement, had worked hard to prevent the emergence of a powerful central government. Now they were in favor of the creation of just a government, one that could withstand the Bolshevik onslaught. It was in this context that the 1921 coup took shape, and with it, the life of the 2-year-old Mohammad Reza was forever changed. The British were not alone in hoping for a strong central government in Iran at the time. Some of Iran's leading Democrats, like the poet Melik Shora Bahar and his circle of friends around the journal Daneshkadeh, had also begun advocating the virtues, indeed the necessity, of a strong, enlightened, but law-abiding leader. It is an often repeated pattern of history that when societies experience prolonged periods of instability and conflict, particularly when opposing poles of power prove incapable of asserting hegemony and maintaining order, that the masses, as well as many in the elite, begin to crave a leader like Julius Caesar or Napoleon. Iran was no exception. By 1921, segments of the middle class and the bazaar merchants began advocating the necessity for a strongman, someone who could establish, after 15 years of chaos and civil strife, some semblance of order. The British were by then in full agreement with this idea. British General Edmund Ironside's famous phrase goes, "What we need now is a military dictatorship." While the military muscle of the dictatorship was to be proved by Reza Khan, the charismatic leader of the Cossack Brigade, the political savvy and connections would come from Said Zia, the journalist who had ridiculed Iran's efforts at participating in the Versailles Treaty. In the early hours of the morning of Esfand 3, 1299, or, that is, February 21st, 1921, the famous Cossack Brigade, led by Reza Khan, moved to take control of the capital, Tehran. They met virtually no resistance. Of the existing state machinery, only the weak, vacillating, and corrupt king was left in power. Hearing of the movement of troops towards the capital, Ahmad Shah became very agitated and talked of immediate flight. But Mr. Smart of the British legation was able to calm him sufficiently to make him abandon his intention. While the British supported the coup, they hoped to maintain a figurehead monarchy. As soon as the Cossacks entered the city, the pusillanimous Ahmad Shah sent for the British ambassador and asked his opinion regarding the line which he should follow. He was nervous. The ambassador was, in his words, able to reassure the king regarding the intentions of the leaders of the movement, and advised him to put himself in communication with them, ascertain their wishes, and grant whatever they might ask. His Majesty, of course, followed the advice of the British, and the next day called Said Zia to the court and entrusted him with the task of forming a government. Said at first proposed to the king that the title of dictator should be given to him, but His Majesty demurred on the ground that this would constitute a humiliation to the person and dignity of the sovereign. Said was named Prime Minister. From their first encounter, it was clear that Said Zia, with his revolutionary disregard for the courtesies of the court, and Ahmad Shah, the timid king, who had nothing other than these courtesies left of his power, despised one another. The brewing tension between the weak monarch and the taunting Said created just enough space for Reza Khan to establish an increasingly prominent place in the complicated but crumbling labyrinth of Qajar power. Within hours of taking power, Said Zia and his ally Reza Khan arrested some 400 of the country's grandees. For the British embassy, this was one of the embarrassing features of the coup. Many of those imprisoned were, according to the embassy, prominent Persians universally known as friends of the British. The purpose of the arrest was, according to Said Zia, simply to fill the empty state coffers. In spite of the emptiness of the treasury, Said told the British embassy, there is plenty of money in the country, and he knew where to look for it. Those arrested, he said, owed thousands of tuman to the government in back taxes and levies. The British embassy agreed with Said and confessed that, in its opinion, the arrested princes owe large sums to the government on various accounts. But beneath the revolutionary rhetoric and aggressive actions of the new cabinet, there was a more sinister purpose, and it had to do with the infamous 1919 agreement. The cabinet, according to its master architects, Said Zia and Reza Khan, came not to bury the 1919 agreement, but to revive it. Said's proposed strategy was cold and calculating in its goals, and cunningly Machiavellian in its proposed method for manipulating public opinion. He advised the British embassy that he would verbally and publicly denounce the infamous 1919 agreement, since, again in his words, without such denunciation, new government cannot get to work. At the same time, the cabinet took steps quietly and without public notice to introduce, as the agreement had stipulated, British advisors in key positions in the government and the military. In order to camouflage the role of British advisors, Said Zia confided to Herman Norman, the British ambassador, public announcements will be made that Persian government proposes to bring in advisors from different European states. The idea is to throw dust in the eyes of the Bolsheviks and native malcontents, while placing two essential administrations in British hands. In short, as the Foreign Office succinctly declared, the new cabinet wanted to scrap the agreement, but to carry out its vital provisions. Despite these realities, in his memoir, Mission for My Country, the Shah claimed that his father and his government at the same time denounced the Anglo-Iranian Treaty of 1919. While there is no record of Reza Khan's views on some of these crucial discussions, there are clear indications that he was at least in agreement with the overall contour of Said's details with the British. Furthermore, once Said Zia fell, Reza Khan reassured the British embassy that he would continue the politics of his fallen ally. A report from the embassy indicates that Reza Khan gave oral assurances of his readiness to cooperate with them, to accept British control of the Ministry of Finance and Ministry of War, and to retain British officers in the north as construction. as instructors. At the same time, in discussions with the ambassador, Reza Khan expressed goodwill towards Great Britain and said that no foreigners had any reason to fear the presence of his men at Tehran. In fact, in the course of this discussion, Reza Khan made it clear that his Cossacks, as well as the leaders of the government, were more than anything worried about Bolshevik advances in Iran. They feared that in the absence of a strong government, the expected departure of British forces would bring about a victory for the Bolsheviks. A new cabinet of Sayyid Zia and Reza Khan, often referred to by its opponents as the Black Cabinet, set out to change the fabric of social life in Iran. Soon after his forces took control of Iran, Reza Khan issued two important declarations. The first made it clear that the Cossacks were loyal to Ahmed Shah and had come to establish law and order. The second began with his now famous self-assertive phrase, "I order." He went on to set out the 9 principles of the new government. They included: all the residents of the city of Tehran must be quiet. The state of the siege is established. All newspaper and prints will be stopped. Public meetings in the houses and in different places are stopped. All shops where wines and spirits are sold, as well as theaters, cinemas, and clubs where gambling goes on, must be closed. In all of this, Reza Khan acted as a pragmatist, while Sayyid Zia never tired of reminding anyone who cared to listen that he considered himself a revolutionary. His two political heroes were often said Lenin and Mussolini. His program included such far-reaching measures as formation of any army, eventual abolition of the capitulations, granting foreigners immunity from prosecution, legislation or readjustment of relations between landlords and peasants. At the same time, he tried to implement a truly impressive number of changes in the capital itself, from ordering new rules of hygiene for stores that dealt with foodstuffs to an attempt to bring light to city streets. How are we there? Might as well stop it right there because